Evening, everybody. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. There's a couple of agenda updates. I think we're going to move under the Finance Committee, Item 5, Budget Amendment 2020-012, Architect Engineering Services for Juvenile Detention Center Roof Replacement, and under Operations and Administrative Committee, Item 3, Resolution awarding A&E Services for Juvenile Detention Center Roof Replacement. I also believe there's some question related to the two finance items related to reconsideration. We'll talk about that under Chairman's report, and we'll adjust accordingly. With that, I would ask the clerk to call the roll, please. Clerk Emma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Neighbors.
Here.
Mrs. Red. Present. Mr. Salgado.
Present.
Mr. Schultz.
Here.
Mr. Tassoni.
Present.
Mr. Webster.
Here.
Mr. Westcott.
Present.
Mr. Arena.
Here.
Mr. Billich.
Here.
Mr. Booker.
Present.
Mr. Boomer. Mr. Butita.
Here.
Mrs. Crosby.
Here.
Mr. Fellers.
Here.
Mr. Fiducia.
Here.
Mr. Gurl.
Present.
Mrs. Gorel.
Present.
Mr. Hoffman.
Present.
Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Mr. McDonald.
Present.
20 present, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Clerk Emma. With that, I will ask everybody to stand for the invocation and pledge, and we're going to turn things over to Mrs. Gorel. Mrs. Gorel.
I'm sorry, people, that I forgot, so we're going to wing it. Thank you. I want to thank your supreme being, whoever it may be, for this day he has given us, or her day. I look at my board, and as I look at all of us, we sure need your grace to get us through these days that are coming up. I want to thank you, and I want to thank all the people who are first responders who take care of us. As I stand here before you, I just wish all of us the best year we will ever have will be this year on this county board, and that we will all be able to work closer together. And with thy help, we will do so. Amen.
I'm going to ask Joe Vanderwerth and our Public Works Chair, Dave Tassoni, Mr. Tassoni, to please come on up. Big announcement tonight. Joe has agreed to a 5-year contract extension. He was afraid to tell his wife in public, so we brought her here this evening so that we could announce this where she cannot kill him. Come on up, guys. I know Mr. Tassoni has a few comments on behalf of the Public Works Committee, but I've been asked by the following folks to just pass along some good wishes to Joe, and I think we all are in agreement to the impact he's had over the last 22 years on our community and in Winnebago County. I think he's a great example worth following for people who work here. But I've been asked by Mayor Chamberlain, the mayor of Belvedere, John Donahue from North Park Water District, Chairman Carl Johnson out of Boone County, Mayor Steve Johnson from Village of McChesney Park, Mayor Greg Jury from the City of Loves Park, Mayor Tom McNamara, City of Rockford, and countless others to pass along their thanks for what Joe has done and how he's partnered with their organizations more than just on one project. For those who have served on this board much longer than I, and there's several of you, you know those projects by name and lived through them. And at the heart of many of the partnerships that have involved Winnebago County that mattered in this community, Joe touched them in one way, shape, or form. He's been a great advisor to many people that have served in your positions and positions all over the county, and myself included. So, Joe, there's a whole lot that I think a lot of people can say and will say that are positive about you and your leadership. You are going to be sorely missed in Winnebago County. There is no doubt. On behalf of all of us, I would like to present you with this plaque for your service and just say thank you from everybody. And then I'm going to turn it over to our friend Mr. Tassoni to say a few words as well. But Joe, thank you for everything you've done. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of the Public Works Committee and myself, and I'm sure most on this board, if not all, Joe, I'd just like to say to you it's been a pleasure serving on the Public Works Committee for the past 12 years, and as of recently as the committee chair. The professionalism and dedication that you've brought to the citizens of Winnebago County, to those that utilize our highway system, and I would like to add Mr. Molina, or Mr. Carlos Molina there, that he has some big shoes to fill, but I'm sure he's up to the task. And I'd just like to wish you well in your future endeavors and many happy days to come with wherever you decide to retire and whatever hobbies that you care to take on. And on behalf of the Public Works Committee, I'd like to present you with something. A little token of appreciation from those of us that had the pleasure of serving with you and considering you our friend.
Well, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you to all of you. All of you who are here are on the board now, and the chairman, and all the former members of the county board, the former chairman, for allowing me, as one of our former presidents said, temporary custody of the office of county engineer. I've had 3 jobs in my life, one with the state of Illinois, one with a consulting firm, and here in Winnebago County. And some of you may find this hard to believe with all the challenges we have as a county, but I love this job. And if I didn't think I needed to retire, I'd probably ask you if I could work another 10 years. So I respect all of you. I thank all of you for your support over the years. I couldn't be happier about how the Highway Department has responded to the county board and what you see as the direction we need to go. And if you just think about all the projects, whether they be safety projects, quality of life projects, just road projects themselves, or economic development projects, you deserve a lot of credit for your foresight and the direction you've given us. And hopefully you'll see in us that we have responded to what you had asked us to do. And I know as you go forward, Carlos Molina is going to be a great county engineer for you and will do an excellent job. He already is. And so I wish all of you the best now and in the future, and you'll always be in my heart as I go forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, Joe. As I just break it, just 1 second. There you go as well. Thank you. See you Friday. Thanks again, Joe. Our next item of business is public comment. I believe we have 2 speakers this evening, Al Ballas and Steve Lucas. I'm going to ask Mr. Ballas to come up, and he is going to speak regarding the cannabis craftsman license in favor of. Al, do you want to come right up here, sir? As Al is coming up, I'll read the disclaimer. Comments shall be limited to 3 minutes. Speakers may not address a zoning matter which is pending before the ZBA, zoning committee, or county board. Personnel matters are pending or threatened litigation may not be discussed in open session. An individual may speak 3 times per calendar year. This prohibition shall include the repetition of the same topic in a statement on what is purported to be a different topic. Personal attacks or inappropriate language of any sort will not be tolerated. And again, Al, welcome, and,
Thank you.
And you're up.
How you doing? My name's Al Police. I'm an Illinois resident. I'm also an Iraqi war veteran. We have started our cannabis craftsman license with the state of Illinois, and we would like to have our license or get our facility in Winnebago County. It'd be a state-of-the-art facility we're pushing for and trying to get. I'm not good at speaking in crowds, so please bear with me. I'm a business owner in the village of New Milford. I own Rockford Liquidation Warehouse. We're a thriving business. We have a lot of points we want to touch about. I know I only got 3 minutes, but I think what we would create with this industry is revenue, jobs, and a lot of unanswered questions to people who are on the fence about the cannabis industry. And we want to open it up to everybody, from security to battling the opioid and heroin epidemic. I've known a lot of veterans who go to the VA when they come out, they get a bag of pills. But if they could switch over to cannabis, it would help them tremendously and get off the prescription drugs. I don't believe cannabis is a gateway drug. It's an exit drug. I've lost 2 sisters to heroin, and it sucks. That's why we're really pushing for this and for the community. I think it'd be a great opportunity for the community. I would love your guys' full support on this through zoning, whatever we have to do to get this done. And we're a complete transparent company, me and my partners. So, I mean, we want to give you tours, have you all involved and your commentary on it, any questions, concerns, so we can all do this together. So I think that's about it.
Thank you very much, Al.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Our next speaker this evening is Steve Lucas. Steve, you here? He is going to talk about the USGS gauge at Perryville and Kishwaukee River. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Thank you for having me. I'm here to talk about, I got a call from a board member about the USGS gauge for the Kishwaukee River at Perryville that the county's going to enter into a 5-year agreement on. As far as gauges go on the river, I'm the president of the Rock River Homeowners Association, and we privately raised the funds to put the gauge in at the dam, and we pay the maintenance cost on that. It's the gauge that the sheriff uses to regulate the dam. It's a stage-only gauge, so what that means, it measures height. The cost on that is $5,500 a year. The homeowners pays for that. The gauge at Auburn Street is paid by the city of Rockford. That's $5,500 a year. The gauge at Latham is paid by McChesney Park, Loves Park, and the county. They all split that. That's $5,500 a year. The gauge at Perryville is a stage and a flow gauge, and the cost of that is $14,400 a year. If they enter into a 5-year agreement with the USGS is going to share the cost of that by 40% with them, but they're still going to be paying $8,640 a year for that gauge at Perryville. If they switch that to a stage-only gauge, they would be saving roughly over $3,000 a year on that. I know the county doesn't always have a lot of money, so anytime we could save money, I would think we would try to. I talked with the USGS John Lagaman today about the gauge and with Scott Lincoln from the National Weather Service about the gauge. Scott is available anytime within the next couple of weeks if the committee needs to talk to him about that before you enter into this agreement for $43,200 for the 5-year maintenance of that gauge. If you went to a stage-only gauge, the county's cost would be cut down to $27,500. So that's a savings of $15,000 over 15 years. I think it'd be in the county's best interest to have Scott Lincoln from the National Weather Service come out and explain that gauge and if the stage-only gauge would work for what you need. So I just wanted to put those numbers out there for you so you know what to look forward to with the cost of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate your comments. Next item of business, moving on from public comment, is a board member correspondence. Any correspondence by board members? Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman. More or less of an announcement than communication, but Just in relationship to the retirement of Mr. Vanderwerf, I'd just like to add, there was an email sent out a little while ago, but I'd just like to say that after serving Winnebago County for 22 years, Winnebago County Joe Vanderwerf is retiring. There is an open house at the Winnebago County Highway Department tomorrow, January 24th, from 2 to 4. And then there is also after-hours festivities, 4:30 to 7:30 at the Verde Club down on Madison Street. And anyone and all is welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni. Other comments by board members? Seeing none, moving on to Chairman's report. It was mentioned today, actually it came to my attention last evening, that the two items related to, the two IT items that touch the Sheriff's Department related to the recent body cam discussion, I asked that they be reconsidered, which is something as chairman I've had the opportunity to do. It was brought to my attention that because it was a no vote in each of those two cases, that for parliamentarian reasons or reasons that are separate from the state statute that gives me the opportunity to ask you to reconsider something, that that may not be the case. So rather than getting into a back and a forth over whether or not we can do this or not, I just want to share this with you, and this may be a better alternative than a shooting match over whether or not we can reconsider something tonight, and that is the absolute importance that we do relook at this issue. So I would be far more interested, you know, if as an alternative to scrap over that and you know, we lose the focus on the issue. The issue is much broader than the body cams. And that is why I asked the board respectfully to reconsider it. I did have a nice conversation with Mr. Hoffman on Saturday, Mr. Boomer last Friday, just about my concern. And it's simple, is that in a very short period of time, a former board action, which was to enthusiastically approve, and as did every other public entity in Winnebago County, this idea of transitioning to shared records management, the idea that we would share police records across law enforcement agencies, which just makes sense, I guess, to an average person who doesn't have a background in law enforcement. That has been worked on, approved by our board in the past, and has been worked on now for well over a year. And that transition, which I believe it's imminent, it is coming in the next couple of months, is reflective of over a year of planning by multiple agencies. We're at the point of jumping off, and that transition would impact Winnebago County's ability to transition that and utilize that. People who can articulate that in more detail would be Gus Gettner from IT and the folks in the Sheriff's Department. I am more concerned about that transition than I am even the project we just talked about, which I think is of vital concern to public safety. I would just ask the board to consider this, is that not taking action on these two IT things in particular, when I had my eyes opened up to the other ways in which it impacts operations, it concerned me. And I just asked the board, if in committee, you bring in Gus and you let him really dig down and dig in on this, I worry that if we don't relook at this in a way that works, then we're going to be seeing this issue come in different ways. And it doesn't have to be adversarial. If you guys don't want to do it in the future, fine. I don't want to fight over it tonight if there's a concern about a process issue. But the real issue is we have some deferred IT items. And on a night that we are going to consider and probably approve, $4 million in highway infrastructure, I would just ask that we have a very serious discussion about how we make these deferred IT items work. There is a pile of them we've asked Gus to wait on because we've had budget challenges. There are a few funding options. This has come up for many, many months. In fact, it was going to be a top item in 2019 to knock out a comprehensive capital plan. I don't mean this. I'm just concerned if we don't take action, then we're going to be in a position to take action after the fact, and it will be at expense of our operating of some key things. So I would ask you to seriously consider that in a way that hopefully works for the board. If Mr. McDonald or Mr. Booker would just have the discussion and turn them loose and ask all the questions you want. Let Gus explain why he's concerned. Let the Sheriff's Department explain why they're concerned. I do think that some of these deferred IT items are of consequence to other public safety departments. I do think that not implementing some of this stuff will have a direct impact on other departments. That was why I asked the board to reconsider it. If there's a procedural barrier, then let's back up and go about it in a way that works for you guys. That's all I have on that particular item this evening. We'll move on to announcements and communications. And with that, I will ask Clerk Gumow to take over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items listed below were received as correspondence.
And we will place those on file. Our next item of business, item 10, the consent agenda. There is 4 items on the consent agenda: the raffle report, bills, approval of December 19 minutes, and the layover of January 9 minutes. May I please have a motion on the consent agenda? Mr. Billick on the motion, Mr. Fellers on the second. Thank you very much. Item is now before the board. We have a motion, a second on the consent agenda. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Next item of business, County Administrator's Report. Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no report tonight.
Thank you very much. Any department head updates? Ann, Chris, Carlos, Gus, hopefully we'll be talking to you soon in a committee about some IT stuff. Next item of business, standing committee reports, Finance Committee, and we'll turn things over to Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The finance has, let's see here, 6 items that we're gonna vote on today. So the first one is Budget Amendment 2020-009, display cabinets, and I move to actually suspend the rules on that so we can vote on it today.
So we've read in Budget Amendment 2020-009, display cabinets, and Mr. Salgado's asking for suspension of rules and a motion. Mr. Hoffman on second, Mr. Boomer on second, Mr. Gurl. Motion a second to suspend the rules so that we could vote separately this evening. Any question or comments by board members on suspending the rules? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We've suspended the rules. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to approve Budget Amendment 2020-009, display cabinets.
Motion by Mr. Salgado on 2020-009, display cabinet. Second, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Boomer, Mr. Gurl. Any discussion by board members? Yes, sir, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we get an explanation of what's involved here?
I'll go to Mr. Salgado.
Yes, these are the display cabinets at the Memorial Hall that I believe it was discussed that they were in the process of getting these. These are actually, it's essentially a grant that they're getting the money for the display cabinets at Memorial Hall. I don't know the specifics, what, the structure, how many, or stuff like that, and we would have to reach out to the person.
I recall that. Thank you.
Yep.
I'll go to Steve real quick. He had his hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This particular item was, the cabinets themselves was approved by this board, I believe, last meeting, or maybe the meeting in December. We determined that we needed a budget amendment in order to spend the money. That's why we're back with this. So, and it's all covered by a state grant, so.
Hopefully that helps clarify that. Any other questions or comments by board members? The item again is the display cabinets. It had been motioned and seconded. Any other questions? Seeing none, all those in favor of this budget amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next item is Budget Amendment 2020-010, Health Department Census, and I move to suspend the rules on that.
We've read in Budget Amendment 2020-10, Health Department Census 2020. Mr. Salgado's asked to suspend the rules. Motion by Mr. Salgado, second by Mr. Boomer and Mrs. Gorel. Any discussion on suspending the rules? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes. We've suspended the rules. Thank you, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to approve Budget Amendment 2020-010, Health Department Census 2020 grant.
Motion by Mr. Salgado on 2020-10 Health Department Census. Mr. Boomer and Mrs. Gorel on the second. Item is now before the board for consideration. Any questions, comments? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next item is Budget Amendment 2020-011, County of Winnebago Census 2020 Grant, and I move to suspend the rules.
Motion by Mr. Salgado to suspend the rules on Budget Amendment 2020-11, 2020-11 Census Grant. Second by Mr. Boomer and Mrs. Gorel again. Any discussion by board members on suspending the rules? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. We've suspended the rules. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I move to approve Budget Amendment 2020-011, County of Winnebago Census 2020 Grant.
Motion, may I have a second? A second by Mr. Gurl, Mr. Boomer, Mr. Neighbors, and Mrs. Gorel. Motion has been, we've had a motion and a second on this County of Winnebago Census grant. Any discussion or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As discussed earlier, item 5, which the architecture has been taken out. So we'll move on to the next one, which is a consideration of ordinance authorizing the issuance by the County of Winnebago, Illinois, of general obligation bonds, alternative revenue source, in aggregate principal amount not to exceed $4 million for the purpose of constructing, maintaining, and improving county highways, roads, and bridges, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. Salgado on the ordinance authorizing the issuance of general obligation bonds not to exceed $4 million for the purpose of county highway projects, roads and bridges. Second by Mr. Webster and Mr. Gurl. Item is now before the board. Any discussion or comments? Yes, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to give a little more information and repeat this again, I know it's been talked about lately, but basically this $4 million, what it is, primarily the function would be to, coming this June, we have some monies through EDP and TARP funds, approximately $2.4 million that we need to come up with approximately $2.2 million of our share so that we don't forfeit those dollars. Primarily, that's what this bond would be funding. In addition, it would be $1.5 million for the resurfacing of Kishwaukee Road down by the airport from Meridian to Beltline. There's a lot of things going on down by the airport with Amazon and truck traffic, and that's necessary as well. So I would encourage the board to vote in favor of this and allow the highway department to follow through with these two projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Any other comments by board members? Yes, Mr. Reno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we discussed this in caucus, and I was told that we're going to service this debt by another bond that's going to be paid off. But there's a period of time when we'll have to make payments on both bonds. Is that correct? Mr. Chapman?
Yes, we just talked about this morning, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The way this bond issue is going to be structured, and really this is the first step in it. You have to, with general obligation bonds, you have to go through a backdoor referendum period and so on. We'll actually sell the bonds at I think it's the second meeting in March, but the way it's structured, the other bonds the highway department has will be paid off, I believe, in 2022, and these bonds we're paying interest only for 3 years, 2 years, I guess it'd be 2 years, and then the balance of the bonds would be paid off over 8 years. So, and the monies that will be used to pay off the bonds will be the monies that previously we used to pay the other bonds off. Right now we have about $2.8 million a year that we have to pay off. So that money will come free in 2023. So we can utilize those funds for this particular bond issue.
But right now, this was budgeted for, or this increases our deficit for this year?
It won't increase our deficit because we're basically using borrowed monies, and which will be paid back in the future. So, and the reason that we're moving forward with this was the whole issue of the the economic development grant that we were going to lose in June if we didn't use it, so.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Arena. Mr. Fellers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quick, I know we don't have all the interest rates right now, but roughly how much is this $4 million going to cost us to borrow?
The interest rate that was presented, obviously, we go through a bid process once we do the bonds. I think it was anticipated to be about 2.25%, which I think over the 10 years is about $600,000.
Thank you.
Any follow-ups, Mr. Fellers? Seeing none. Mr. Schultz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the 2.2 million, the matching and all of that just obviously is running out of time, so we've got to do something on that. But in terms of the other projects, I guess my concern is do those represent the very most egregious areas that have to be dealt with? I mean, how did we come to that decision that $1.8 million is going to go to Kishwaukee Road? And is that really the most intense need as it relates to the overall projects on our list?
I'll defer to Steve and/or Carlos. I do know these two projects were on the capital needs list from very early on. I don't know if they were one or two, or if the matching funds kind of jumped them in line because we were going to lose them, but I would defer to Steve or Carlos for any feedback they want to give.
I would defer to Carlos and maybe the Public Works Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a lot of roads that need work. Kishwaukee is one at the top of the list. If we do not get this $1.5 million, we could address this road, but it will take time. We do have other roads that need quite a bit of work. This is one of the worst. And the decision, came from the Highway Department, or the recommendation, I'm sorry, it came from the Highway Department.
Thank you, Carlos. Any follow-ups, Mr. Schultz?
I think he's saying that it is at the top of the list, and it really has to be done in excess of other potential projects, and that's what I'm trying to get at.
That's correct.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Just for the record, do we anticipate more highway-related projects coming forward as recommendations on the capital side in the next year or two? I guess just so we're clear on the board floor, this is obviously a decent-sized spend. Is there going to be others like it as part of a larger package coming or not? And I just want to make sure we understand context. Steve, there was some discussion on that, or Carlos?
I think the fact that the Highway Department is going to be receiving additional motor fuel tax monies with the new raise in the gas tax and so on, I think the department and the Public Works Committee is looking at additional projects which would be funded through those particular funds as opposed to bonded funds, and that's why we only went forward with the $4 million for the bond. So I suspect, there will be additional projects coming down the road.
Thank you, Steve. Anything you want to add, Carlos? And then I see Mr. Webster's following that up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You asked about what's coming up in the next year. We do have, thanks to the additional gas tax, we do have projects that without that gas tax we wouldn't have been able to do. One of them is Montague Road that needs it bad, just as much as Kishwaukee. And as far as going into the future, we do have a plan that we will be bringing to you, for the next 4 or 5 years, as far as roads that need some work.
Do you have a rough ballpark range or dollar amount tagged for what you'd be bringing forward on that 4 or 5 year ask?
I do not. I would be guessing if I told you.
Okay, we'll give you some time on that. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, without getting real specific about it either, I don't think if the questions would have come up we would have known and prepared. But we have been discussing this at Public Works Committee there for some time now, and I think that this board, and I think maybe the community too, will be surprised about the capital works we have. We do have a capital works plan. And so there's going to be so many projects coming up here in the very near future, last couple of years I'm talking about, and there's going to be a lot of road work. You're going to see construction all around the county here within the next few years. And I would think that perhaps maybe we should share the projects list maybe at our next meeting, Carlos? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? The projects list that Mr. Webster rightly pointed out, we've seen that list, and that's been prioritized out of the Highway Department. How much of that list is currently budgeted, meaning there's a funding path associated with that list? Is there still, at the end of the day, with rosy, better than initially projected revenue streams from like new revenue sources, this bonding opportunity, is there still going to be gap funding needed that's we got a project, but we don't have funding accounted for it at the end of that list? Carlos?
Yes, thank you. Our plan, or my plan, and I know the Public Works Committee as well, and I do not want to speak for them, but is that, we will be able to fund all those projects that you're going to see in that list, thanks to the additional gas tax, and as well as Steve said, in two years, we're going to have the additional $2.8 million from the bonds that we're currently paying. So we do have, we will be able to fund all those projects that are going to be on that list.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Any other follow-ups? Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll just, my best recollection, chairing the Public Works Committee, and we've heard from the IT department, Mr. Gus Gettner, and somewhere of upwards of $10 million of improvements over the next 5 years or so for IT. And I think when it comes to roads and rebuilding roads, the dollar amount that's needed to fix the roads is much more than that. And as we do look forward to better days coming with some bond payments, retirements, and some additional MFT funds, I would encourage this board, and I've pled and I've talked about it for my whole tenure on this board, that I would like to see some allocations of host fee funds dedicated to the Highway Department to offset or at least matching funds. And I would plead with this board to at least consider that those host fee funds should be allocated to help offset the cost for rebuilding roads. And in my opinion, that is a direct relationship to economic development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni. Any other comments by board members? Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. These are the same roads that service the airport, are they not? Because of the fact that we have all this air traffic coming in here and trucks are going every which direction, it's so important that we get these highways straightened out and fixed up, because it's only going to hurt our economic development if we don't go forward and continue working on those highways to get them done. We've started some of it over the years, but now we need to go even further. And when you're talking about Montague Road, are you talking about it starting at the, where does that start and where does that end, the repair that's going to be done to that road?
I'll go to Carlos on that one.
Thank you. Yeah, the project that we have scheduled for this year is going to be from Meridian Road going to Kennedy Hill. It's about 3.5 miles long.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Any other questions or comments by board members? Seeing none. On this ordinance, it's the $4 million for the highway projects. We have a motion and a second, and so all those in favor of this expenditure signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is a resolution to enter into an intergovernmental cooperation agreement for assessment, complaint, intervention, and defense, and I so move.
Got a motion by Mr. Salgado on the resolution related to the the IGA for assessment, complaint, intervention, and defense. May I have a second, please? Mr. Girl, thank you very much. We have a motion and a second. Can we get a quick 30-second overview of this by either Mr. Salgado or the appropriate staff?
Yeah, so this is pretty much essentially anytime, this is to hire an attorney to represent us on any assessments over $100,000, I believe, when asking for a reduction in their taxes. So essentially, it's a defense for us, and our portion is about $7,600. I believe the fund is $100,000, but if I'm not mistaken. But essentially, that's what this resolution's in regards to. So I can take any other questions if you guys have any questions.
Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is a resolution authorizing the settlement of pending litigation, Bates versus Winnebago County, in the amount of $20,000. And I so move.
Motion by Mr. Salgado on the resolution authorizing settlement of pending litigation, Bates versus Winnebago County. May I have a second, please? Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Girl. Item is now before the board for discussion or questions. And the settlement, Mr. Salgado, just to put on record, what's the amount again?
As I mentioned, it's $20,000.
20,000. Sorry about that. Any questions? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last two items, as the chairman has explained, we took those out from advisement of the state's attorney's office regarding that, and I'm not going to get into the details and debate about this. Essentially, the veto power only pertains to things that can be asked for reconsideration again on things that are passed by the county board that would like reconsideration. That's what I've been told. That's what essentially accounts for this. However, that does not mean that we could see these budget amendments come through the committee again. If it's so wanted by the committee and the board to take action on these items, it can come through the committee, the finance committee, and we'll make a decision, and it'll come to the county board as a whole. So the process is still there. We do have a process. We'll follow the process, and going forward, that's my recommendation. If it's urgent and it's wanted 100% that we need these things, by all means, please pass it through the finance committee. We can get those budget amendments again. We'll take a vote, and we'll see what happens after that. So on that note, also too, regarding these capital projects and everything like that, I know that we had some sort of plan, and I know that our last county administrator was working on that diligently. Things are going to continue to come up, and unfortunately, we need to take action. I think Steve has kind of looked at it, kind of been doing some research on that, but we need to press on those issues, and it was part of, we kind of let that go. That's something that we're going to have to push forward, but those are needs. It's going to come up. People are going to ask for additional spending, money. I need this, I need that. It's going to come down. So it's just, we need to push through and make it a big item so we can get a capital project, a CIP program that we have out here for the next 5 years, whatever it is, 10 years that we want to do strategically long-term. And we understand that. So there's a lot of questions of things about IT and so forth, but we must not lose sight of where our finances are and how we can strategically make decisions for the next 5 to 10 years, whatever it may be. We need to strategically think about these things and not just pinpoint. So I'm hoping that Steve and the next administrator can start working on that so we can have a complete CIP essentially signed off and financed, so we don't get into these issues. But those are the things. I just wanted to make those comments because I've been hearing, just listening to this. I also talked to the auditors. Auditors gave me a call. They will be presenting at our next finance committee, I believe, just how they're doing their field work and so forth. Everything's looking okay. They asked me some questions about fraud and everything like that, so everything is going, but I just wanted to notify you guys of that, so that's going to come down to the finance committee. So But that concludes my report, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. As Mr. McDonald's coming up, I believe Mr. Chapman here is going to share an update on the public safety building, which is obviously intimately tied to Capitol, at an upcoming committee meeting. I think it was at the end of 2018, we hired the program manager to take us through the facilitated project step by step on planning the repurposing or demolition of that building. This is the building that we left for most part when we built the new the jail for the sheriff, and we had this new sales tax come in. We've collected $400,000 or $500,000 now in sales tax revenue since the inception of that tax, but we've never planned to deal with the future of this public safety building. And I do think that's intimately tied to this all the capital discussion. It has been confirmed by multiple professional staff that we're spending several $100,000 a year operating the mostly obsolete, not all obsolete, but mostly public safety building. And if we dealt with a long-term plan, maybe we could free up some operational cash for a number of things, even if it's a bond payment. So I just throw that, I think that's an intimately important part of this larger discussion. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Operations Committee has 4 items for you this evening. The first is a resolution to pay for your emergency purchase for fire eye maintenance, and I so move.
Got a motion by Mr. McDonald to pay for emergency purchase for fire eye maintenance. May I have a second, please? Thank you, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Fellers. Any discussion by board members on this first item out of the Operations Committee? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is a resolution to change the hours of the County Clerk's office on Election Day, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. McDonald on awarding A&E services for the Item 4, resolution to change the hours of the county clerk's office. I have a motion by Mr. McDonald, sorry about that, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Neighbors on the second. Item is now before the board. A motion is second, just so I'm clear and I don't confuse anybody, to change the hours in the clerk's office on Election Day. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you very much. Motion passes unanimously. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next, we have a resolution authorizing placing a binding question on the public ballot before the electors of Winnebago County to adopt the county executive form of government in the county of Winnebago, Illinois.
Got a motion by Mr. McDonald on the resolution related to the county executive ballot question, second by Mr. Fellers. Item is now before the county board for questions, comments. Mr. Petito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As one of the co-sponsors, along with Gene Crosby, just like to make a few comments on this. First of all, the state constitution does permit or does allow for the voters to have a choice in the type of government that county government that they have, and those choices are either township, commissioner form of government, or the executive form of government. So what is before us this evening is not whether we're in favor of the executive style form of government, but whether we're in favor of the voters deciding on that issue, which would be on the general election ballot in November. It is a binding referendum. So I would urge my fellow members to concentrate on what is before us here tonight, that we're voting on the issue of placing this on the ballot, not on the issue of whether we're for or against the executive form of government. And lastly, I would just say that I know that there has been argued a couple times in the committee meetings that this is a complex issue that possibly the voters won't be able to comprehend or should not be put to them. But I would disagree respectfully that I put all my trust in the voters. They've sent us here, and they have the right through the Constitution to have a choice in their government. So I'm in favor of them having a choice in November. So I would vote to approve this tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments by board members? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand that we're not, our vote tonight isn't whether we're endorsing this question, whether we want the executive form or not. I still feel, I've said this in committee, I think it's unnecessary to do it now. It doesn't take effect until, if it were adopted, until 2024. If we were to wait until 2022 to put this question to the voters, they would have had the chance to experience county government with a different administration, a different chairman, a different administrator. In 2022, there's a new board coming up for election. I also think that this hanging out there throughout this year will be a distraction in our search for a new administrator. And for those reasons, I'll be voting no tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Any other questions? Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairman. I disagree with Mr. Petit. I just want to say this isn't about whether the people have a right to vote for a certain kind of government. It's about whether this board supports that vote. We're not saying that people don't have a right to vote for it. We're saying, do we as a body support that move? That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Any other questions, comments by board members? Yes, Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. I have to agree with Mr. Arena and what he's saying, and I will be voting no on this. I have a real problem with the word binding. This is not a question to the taxpayer if they would like to vote on this. What it's saying to them, vote on this and you got it. You aren't going to have a choice after that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gorel. Any other questions, comments by board members? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote would put it on the ballot. A no vote would keep it off the ballot. The ballot we're referring to is November of 2020. Clerk, come on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Red? No. Mr. Salgado?
No.
Mr. Schultz? No. Mr. Tassoni?
No.
Mr. Webster? No. Mr. Westcott?
No.
Mr. Arena?
No.
Mr. Billich?
No.
Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? No. Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby?
Yes.
Mr. Fellers?
Yes.
Mr. Fiducia?
No.
Mr. Gurl?
No.
Mrs. Gorel?
No.
Mr. Hoffman?
No.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Motion fails, and we'll turn things back over to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last item we have for tonight is resolution authorizing execution of intergovernmental cooperation agreement amongst the County of Winnebago, Illinois, the City of Loves Park, the Village of McChesney Park, the Village of Cherry Valley, the Village of Durand, the Village of Pecatonica, the Village of Rockton, the Village of Roscoe, the City of South Beloit, and the Village of Winnebago. And I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. McDonald on the 911 agreement between the county and its municipal partners, minus the city of Rockford, who has their own 911 facility. May I have a second? Mr. Salgado, thank you. Item has been motioned and seconded. Mr. Westcott is a second as well. I just want to acknowledge real quick Scott Sanders, the administrator from the village of Rockton, who's one of the partners in the coalition, doing a great job there. He's just in attendance. The guy, the second best bald guy, good-looking bald guy in the room. But thank you, Scott, for everything you're doing. Item is before the board for discussion. Yes, sir, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the last time, I would like to make a motion to send this back to the joint committees, and the reason is there's 3 items that if we can come to agreement on these 3, we'll have all of the coalition members on board. Right now, there are 5 who are not on board. I think it would behoove us to bring this back and get all 9 of them on the same page and finally be done with this. So I'll make a motion to send it back to the committees.
We got a motion to send this back to committee, to the operations committee. Several hands are up. Let me get to you. Mr. Booker, Mr. Kelly, Mr. I think Westcott and Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Webster and Mr. Billick. Motion and now multiple seconds to send this on back to committee. Any discussion on, a yes vote sends it to committee, a no vote keeps it here? I see a hand up, Mr. Petita.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald?
Yes, sir.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason for the, or if we do approve these three changes in committee, the active date, or the effective date will revert back to October 1st, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just want to make sure, thank you.
Any other questions or comments before taking the vote whether or not to send this back to committee? Seeing none, all those in favor of sending it back to committee signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? We've sent it back to committee unanimously. Mr. McDonald.
That concludes my report. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Next item of business, Public Works Committee, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Public Works Committee brings forth three resolutions this evening. First item on the agenda is a resolution 20-003, and it's a resolution authorizing the execution of a joint funding agreement with the United States Department of the Interior Geological Survey for the operation of a stream flow gauging station on the Kishwaukee River. I would so move and ask to speak to it as well.
We got a motion by Mr. Tassoni on the resolution 20-003 related to the stream flow gauging station on the Kishwaukee River. Second by Mr. Girl. Thank you very much. And Mr. Hoffman, thank you. Item is now before the board for discussion and consideration. Any questions, comments by board members? Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am the one who asked Mr. Lucas to speak on this tonight. I also live on the river and Rock River. I understand how important gauging is to figuring things out and how things are working and what we can do to prevent problems later. The problem that I have is this is the Cadillac of the gauges. So I would love to send this back to your committee and have it brought back again with a baseline gauge that I could support, but I would have a hard time approving the Cadillac of the gauges.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Any other questions, comments, or you want to speak to that, Mr. Tassoni?
Yeah, as I made in my initial statement, I did ask to speak to that, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I apologize.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
And what I would like to say is just based on my recollection of a stage gauge versus a flow gauge, you know, I'm not sure many people know what the difference is. And my recollection is what the flow gauge does is allows me to know what the trend may be in the next 5 to 7 days approximately it might be as far as the river rising or receding. I would defer to Mr. Carlos Molina for his interpretation of the importance for the Highway Department based on their uses and their needs for it.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Mr. Tassoni. My mistake.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. The difference is between a stage only and a stage discharge gauging station, which is what this one is the information that you collect from the from this type of gauging station. There are 6 gauging stations in Winnebago County, 3 that are stage only, and 3 that are discharge in stage. 1 on the Kishwaukee River, the one that we're bringing to you today. There's 1 on the Rock River, and then there's 1 on the Pecatonica River. The information that you can collect is basically flow, how much discharge goes through the river. And that information is used by many people. It's public information, by the way. We use it to design culverts, to design bridges, and all kinds of drainage studies, hydrologic studies. Engineering consultants can use it as well. FEMA uses it, you know, the flood rates, they utilize that to create their floodplain maps. It does cost $14,000, of which the county would be paying 60%, $8,600 or so. The USGS would be contributing, as you can see here, it's about $4,000 or $5,000. This gauging station can be turned back to a stage only, but then the USGS would not be contributing anything. The county would be paying the $5,500 alone. So it's basically the amount of information that you can get, and it does benefit the residents of the county. because it might help them with their flood insurance, because of the flood plain maps. It does help the highway department when we design culverts. You can do all kinds of estimates based on just data. This gives you better information to provide better designs, hydrologic designs. I would recommend to allow us to continue doing that. And if not, it's okay. Now, the gauging station can be removed, and then it would just go away. But again, it can be turned back to a staging only, and the county would pay $5,500, which is what the other ones cost. By the way, the other two discharge stations cost the same, $14,400, and they are paid by other entities. So again, that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Any follow-up?
Yeah, just to add to that, Mr. Chairman, for the purposes of this resolution, the initial $8,640 is budgeted for this year. It's a 5-year plan, and I would respectfully ask for approval of this, and if we so desire to do away with it or restructure the gauging system, I would ask for that to be done in future years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Mrs. Gorel, then Mr. Fellers. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. With the type of weather changes that we have had recently, we have new floodplains that we didn't have before. With this type of gauge, give us some idea that what's happening in the future with our floodplains going in different directions what they have. And if it does, then this is very vital to our county so we know and can predict where the new floodplains are going to be. And I agree, this is how you're going to be building your new bridges and putting in culverts. Am I on target or am I off target?
I'll go to Carlos on that.
You are on target.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Fellers, do you have your hand up? Nope. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Mr. McDonald, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You said we have 3 gauges now, Carlos. This is a current gauge?
This is an existing gauge, and it has been being used since 1992.
Okay. And they're just the 5-year extensions to renew what we had been doing?
Correct. The reason why we bring it as a 5-year, because that cost has been going up little bit by signing a 5-year agreement. That $8,600 fee will stay firm for the next 5 years.
And I know the Latham gauge is shared by several taxing bodies. Have we approached Cherry Valley or any other entities that would be directly impacted by the Kishwaukee River?
We have not. We have not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald, on the follow-up. Thank you, Carlos. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Carlos, is it correct that this is the last gauge at the point on the Kishwaukee River before it flows into the rock, and therefore this would be measuring the volume of discharge or water flowing into the Rock River just south of the airport?
Carlos.
I'm looking at Sean, by the way, but for those of you that do not know Sean Van Bergen, he's our drainage engineer, and he's nodding his head. So the answer to your question is yes.
Okay, so in this case, this gives us a measurement on, not just the height of the Kishwaukee at that location, but the volume of water that is entering the Rock River below the dam, correct?
That is correct. It measures discharge.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Any other follow-ups? Anything? Okay, with that, the item, of course, before the board is the steam flow gauging station on the Rock River, or the survey related to. We've had a motion and a second. Any other questions before we vote? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? No. We got a hand up if you're no vote. Just so I don't miss you. Mr. McDonald and Mr. Billick will cast as no votes. All other board members will cast as yes votes. Motion passes. Mr. Tassoni. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on, we have next item is 20-004, and it's a resolution declaring as surplus highway department vehicles and equipment and authorizing the sale, and it is tied, so to speak, with the next resolution, and I would so move.
We have a motion on item 320-004, resolution declaring a surplus highway department vehicles, equipment, and authorizing sale. Motion by Mr. Tassoni, second by Mr. Webster and Mr. Girl. Any discussion by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next item is Resolution 20-005. It's a resolution authorizing the Highway Department to lease additional light-duty vehicles from Enterprise FM Trust. I so move and would like to speak to it as well.
Okay. Motion by 20-005, resolution authorizing the Highway Department to lease additional light-duty vehicles from Enterprise FM Trust. Second, please, Mr. Webster, Mr. Gurl. Item is now before the board. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This basically is, for a period of time, we've foregone the leasing of vehicles just due to budget constraints and things, but it has been determined that there's a necessity for at least 5 light-duty pickup trucks. The resolution we passed prior will allow them to liquidate and sell at auction or whatever necessary, the used old iron, so to speak, the rusty things and things that are high maintenance. And like I say, this just brings us up to getting few new vehicles, light-duty pickup trucks for the Highway Department.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Any other comments, questions by board members? Yes, sir, Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify here, we're leasing and not purchasing. Does the lease price relate to any discounts that that governments get on these vehicles, or because we're leasing, where it's just dictated by our agreement with the leasing company?
I would refer to Mr. Molina.
Carlos.
Thank you. Yeah, it is at a discounted price, similar to what we would get if we went through the state.
Thank you.
Getting a lot of airtime. We didn't put this kind of pressure on Joe all these years. Man, good job. Any other follow-ups? Okay, with that, all those in favor, it's 20-005, the lease additional light-duty vehicles from Enterprise. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni.
And then one additional item, as I see, Joe didn't stick around for these lengthy meetings. He took his plaques and his acknowledgements and bailed out. But I would just ask for a round of applause for Mr. Molina as he steps into the seat there and becomes our next county engineer.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Next item of business, Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker. Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, just one more item related to Public Works. I just want to give a shout out and a big thank you to Fred Westcott for making the plaque that we presented to Joe Benedict. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Westcott. Thank you, Mr. Webster. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. The Public Safety Committee has 3 resolutions and 1 ordinance. The 3 resolutions involve federal grants from the Department of Justice. Number 1 is a resolution approving subcontractor agreement for the Department of Justice Violence Against Women, fiscal year 15 Justice for Families Grant. And this is a subcontractor grant with Rockford Sexual Assault Counseling, and I move for its adoption.
We got a motion by Mr. Booker, thank you, approving the subcontractor agreement for the Department of Justice Violence Against Women Justice for Families Grant, Rockford Sexual Assault Counseling. Second by Mr. Fellers. Item is now before the board for discussion or questions. Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker.
And again, number 2, a resolution approving subcontractor agreement for the Department of Justice Violence Against Women, fiscal year Justice for Families Grant. This one will go to Remedies Renewing Lives, and I move for its adoption.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Motion by Mr. Booker on the resolution approving subcontractor agreement related to the Violence Against Women Justice for Families Grant for Remedies. Second by Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Salgado, thank you. Mr. Hoffman. Any discussion? Mr. Butita.
Thank you. I want to be abstaining on this resolution and the next one involving remedies because I have a family member on the board of remedies.
Thank you. So we'll note for the record, Mr. Butita will not vote on 3 or 4, the 2 items related to remedies renewing lives. Thank you, Mr. Butita. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. Number 3 is a resolution approving First Amendment to subcontractor agreement for the Domestic Violence Homicide Prevention Demonstration Initiative Phase 2 grant. This also goes to Remedies Renewing Lives, and I make a motion to approve.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Resolution approving First Amendment of subcontract agreement for the Domestic Violence Homicide Prevention Demonstration Initiative Phase 2 grant for Remedies. Second by Mr. Salgado. Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Any discussion by board members? Seeing none, and we'll just note Mr. Butita will abstain from this as well. Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker.
And our final item is ordinance. An ordinance prohibiting the establishment of cannabis dispensing organizations within unincorporated Winnebago County. And I move for its adoption.
We have a motion by Mr. Booker on the ordinance prohibiting the establishment. Oh, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Fellers. We have this item in to be laid over. Would you like to make a motion to
Yes,
suspend the rules so that we could vote this evening?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to suspend.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Booker. We've read the item in. Thank you for cleaning that up for me. Now we have a motion by Mr. Booker to suspend the rules on this fifth item, the ordinance prohibiting the establishment of cannabis dispensing organizations within the unincorporated portions of Winnebago County. I have a second on the motion to suspend by Mrs. Gorel. Now the motion to suspend is before the board. Any discussion on specifically suspending the rules or not? Mr. Fellers? Would you like to speak to this layover, or Mr. Fellers?
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. We've got to vote to suspend it first.
Okay, Mr. Boomer, did you have your hand up? Yeah, you can speak, we can speak to this. The item is to lay the item over. If you're speaking directly to whether or not to lay it over.
No, it's to suspend.
Just
To
suspend.
suspend the rules, I apologize, to suspend the rules. Sorry, I started bad and I've just continued on this one, just horrible. So whether or not to suspend the rules is before the board. Yes, sir, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What's the reason for suspending the rules? Is it something we need to
It
run?
was unanimous through committee.
Right. I just wonder if the community has had a chance to absorb it. You know, I think for that reason, I'd rather not suspend the rules, but I did vote for it in committee, so, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arena. Mr. Boomer.
I don't know if the state's attorney can answer this, but isn't there only 3 licenses in Winnebago County that have been granted by the state of Illinois?
Point of order, just on suspension.
The suspension,
This is a mute point to vote on if there's only 3, because there's already been 3 dispensaries.
the item, I'll give Mr. Boomer some latitude if that works, in that he's trying to determine whether or not this is urgent based on the fact it may be a moot point. I'm reaching here, but we'll give a little room. Could somebody clarify that, Marilyn?
This goes to unincorporated Winnebago County. I don't believe there are any dispensaries of this nature currently in unincorporated Winnebago County. Those other ones that are operating, my understanding is within the city limits of Rockford. Dave has corrected me. There are 2 in Rockford and 1 in South Beloit.
Thank you
This-
very much. Oh, go ahead. Did you have something
I
else you
just
wanted?
wanted to reiterate again, this goes to unincorporated Winnebago County.
Yes. So the motion and second is to suspend the rules, which would allow us to take a separate action tonight to vote this up or down. Again, we're talking about motion to whether or not to suspend the rules. Any other questions directly related to suspending the rules? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? No. Let's ask the clerk to call the roll, because I heard several voices. Yes vote suspends, a no vote would have the item lay over. Clerk, I'm up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz? Yes. Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
No.
Mr. Arena?
No.
Mr. Billich?
No.
Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Butita? Mrs. Crosby? Mr. Fellers?
Yes.
Mr. Fiducia? Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Goro?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
No.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Neighbors? Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Fellers?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just going to clarify before you tally that up. Mr. Webster is indicating to me he's a no vote. Can we just confirm that so there's no inaccurate? Is that correct, sir? Okay, thank you. Mr. Webster is noted as a no vote.
We have a tie vote.
We have a tie vote.
We have a tie vote,
So
Mr.
if I
Chairman.
vote yes, we're going to suspend the rules and take action this evening.
I will change my vote to a no vote. You do not need to do this tonight, it's fine.
Well, I would be a no vote, I would be a no vote on this as well. So either way we do it, the motion fails. I'll go back to Mr. Booker. So we have laid over, we've read in, and the motion to suspend the rules has failed, so it will be laid over. It will come back in 2 weeks, so it'll still be before the board for action at that time. Mr. Booker, I'll come back to you.
So then we make a motion to lay it over? No.
Nope, it's just read in, so it automatically, as an ordinance, sits for 2 weeks.
Got it, very good. There's one question with Mr. Webster.
Mr. Webster?
Yeah, the reason I voted no on this would be to, in an effort to perhaps maybe look at it a little better at committee level, because obviously, going by that vote that just went down here, a lot of people aren't fully aware of, what you're trying to accomplish with this, so.
Mr. Webster makes an interesting point that, just to clarify, so there's no confusion, I do think that there'll be discussion in the next 2 weeks, but because it's laying over, just so we understand what we did, it will come back, since it's at the board level, it'll come back to the board in 2 weeks at this point. But there will be a lot of discussion to Mr.
Yeah,
Webster's
yeah.
very good point.
And if I might, in conjunction with that, we had, let's see, I'm sorry. We had Al come in here, I can't remember the last name, Belize, I think it is, and he spoke about what his intentions are. And these are two totally different things, but it seems as though any time the word cannabis comes up, there's always some confusion, about who can smoke it, who can't, medical versus anybody, and then growers, where can they grow, what kind can they grow, and all that. And so I think for clarification purposes, that's the reason I voted no on this, okay?
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Mr. Fellers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Webster. I would just like to say that we spent 2 full sessions in the Public Safety Committee reviewing this ordinance, initially amending the initial one, sending it back to the state's attorney's office, and we've actually put together what we, as the Public Safety Committee, unanimously agree was a very good compromise on this issue, and I think we'll be happy in 2 weeks to discuss this with the full board and the reasons for the compromise position that we took. Thank you.
So item 5 is laid over to the next board meeting at this point. Any other discussion? Oh, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I understand Mr. Webster's question on it, and maybe I should have been clearer, but it's absolutely fine to lay it over and go back. But what I know of it is that this just prohibits the sale of cannabis in unincorporated Winnebago County. I know I received a lot of phone calls, emails, letters, as well as you have, on a lot of citizens expressing their desire to keep cannabis completely out of Winnebago County, which is something that was out of our hands anyway. So we felt, in board members that I've spoken to and in committee, that if we can do something to appease our citizens, and any little step that we can take as a board, and that was to prohibit the sales of cannabis. But it does not prohibit the production, the growing, the cultivation of it. And I believe that's what the citizen was speaking to when he stepped forward. So we've got that clarified. So it won't, no harm, no foul on going back, so we'll bring it back in 2 weeks, and I hope I cleared up a little bit of it for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. Appreciate the discussion. Anything else for Mr. Booker, Public Safety Committee?
And if I could just close out, I encourage our board members to take serious consideration. I know I'll be getting with Finance Committee Chair and other board members on finding a way, whether it's through reserves or anything, to get this IT upgrade. If we were to make a list, a piece of paper, draw a line right down the middle that says must-have items and nice-to-have items, I think this would go into the must-have column. This isn't something that's a luxury, that's a cool thing to have. It's something that's essential. And my terminology is mission essential. So hopefully we can get this worked out. We'll find something. But it's something that I encourage our board members to seriously take into consideration. Thank you very much. That concludes my report, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. Next item of business, Mr. Fiducia, Personnel Policy Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Personnel and Policies Committee brings in this evening 2 resolutions. The first resolution is a resolution authorizing the chairman of the county board to execute an agreement with GovUSA LLC for the employment of intern county administrator Steve Chapman, and I so move.
We've got a motion by Mr. Fiducia regarding the agreement with Temp USA LLC related to the continued working with our interim administrator, Steve Chapman, second by Mrs. Gorel, second by Mrs. Red and Mr. Hoffman. Item is now before the board. Could we just get a very high-level overview of some of the particulars related to this agreement so that it's clear for the record? Mr. Fiducia, or would...
I'd like to defer to Mr. Chapman.
Kind of weird to ask Steve to speak to his own thing related to him, but can somebody speak to just a couple high-level specifics for the record? Steve?
This particular agreement, let me see here, indicates that the position term would be from February 3rd, 2020 to April 3rd, 2020, with the understanding that the agreement could be extended for up to 2 additional months through June 5th, 2020, with mutual agreements of the party. Compensation rate is $66.30 for the individual employee, and then the 40% GovTemp's fee, which makes a total rate of $92.82. Hours would vary per week, but our expected average 30 to 40 hours a week. Assigned employees shall be paid for hours worked, and so on.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question then, is this designed, are we moving, essentially you are going to become an employee of GovTemps and then contracted to us, therefore it doesn't affect, it alleviates any effect on retirement benefits or whatever, because you're not a state or county employee anymore, but you are a independent or a third-party contractor?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Thank you, Steve, for adding that information. Any other comments, questions? Okay, with that, seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next is a resolution of the County Board of the Winnebago, Illinois, authorize the chairman of the county board to execute agreement with GovHR to conduct a search for a county administrator subject to the review and approval and agreement by the Office of the State's Attorney, and I so move.
The resolution is authorizing the hiring of GovHR related to the search for the county administrator position. May I have a second, please? Second, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Boomer, no, I'm sorry, Mr. Webster. Item has now been motioned and seconded, and the motion is to approve GovHR to also lead the search for the county administrator. Mr. Boomer has his hand up. Mr. Boomer.
I'd like to amend the resolution to change it from GovHR to Workplace.
So we have a motion by Mr. Boomer to amend the resolution from GovHR to workplace. Motion, and may I have a second to Mr. Boomer's motion? I got Mr. Webster, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Fellers, Mr. Billick, Mr. Petita. If I missed anybody, Mr. Arena. So motion in several seconds on the changing of the recommendation of who would lead the search from GovHR to workplace. Any discussion on this amended motion by Mr. Boomer, Mr. Webster?
Yes, I would be opposed to the amendment because I think we ought to vote on what's been proposed, what's in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Any other comments or questions? Mr. Petita.
Thank you. I would vote in favor of it, the amendment. I believe that we have a local firm that it was capable of doing it, the job, and I would like to see them get the work. And I believe that, there's going to be, this is an important position, that the local ownership of this of workforce can probably recruit and do a better job of recruiting the right type of person for us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Petita. I know there's a couple hands. If I go out of order, I apologize. Mr. Billick, then Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Girl. Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to actually echo what Mr. Petita said there as well. One of the opportunities that we finally have, I mean, we as a county board have been bragging, and we have done a very awesome job as much as we possibly can, but we always brag about how much we actually support our local businesses and how much we want to support our local economic climate. We have an opportunity, like John Petita says, to use a local business to do the hiring for a local community government employee. So we actually have an opportunity here to utilize a service that we actually already have locally that we can use. It would behoove me to go with somebody that actually doesn't have as much, I guess, writing on that. This is a local business, meaning this is a local business who depends on creating the best possible local outcome because it affects them very heavily to not give the best outcome. So I would rather try to give it to workplace as well, like Mr. John said. Local business, we preach that all the time, and I'd like to actually support that kind of method. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. Billick, and then I had I had Mrs. Crosby. Mrs. Crosby.
Okay. I concur with Mr. Billich and Mr. Butita. It's a very capable firm, and they will throw the net wide. They will, this will be advertised, you'll have people from Des Moines or Omaha. I mean, they're an incredibly capable firm, and they'll take very good care of us. So I'm glad we're doing local, and I think they'll do a great job.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Crosby and Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a few questions. And maybe Chairman Fiducia can answer these, but is this going to be for a full-time county administrator or a part-time administrator? That would be my first question.
A full-time.
Thank you. And is there language that we need to change along with this amendment proposed by Mr. Boomer on any financials tied? Is there any difference between GovHR and workplace as far as the amounts go?
The amounts, Mr. Chapman could probably refresh my memory on the workplace. Workplace was, I think, 10% or 20% of the starting salary of the employee, and I'm not sure what GovHR was.
Mr. Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did request proposals from both of the agencies because I knew that it would be discussed tonight. The fee from workplace was $34,500, and that also you'd also pay for any expenses for candidates coming in, such as that. GovHR was $19,500. So.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chapman. Any other follow-up questions? I apologize. I know there was a hand or two up after Mr. Girl. Was it Mr. Neighbors and Mr. Westcott? Okay. Okay. Sorry about that, Mr. Westcott.
I just want to concur with the
Mr. Billich and Mr. Crosby on this one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Webster, and then Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Webster.
Gives me pause to wonder why there's such a discrepancy between these. And oftentimes when we say we go out for bid on something, generally we do a low bid, and there's quite a bit of savings between the two firms. You know, so, yeah, when we're looking at spending the taxpayer's dollar, I think perhaps we should remain with what's on the docket here about going with GovHR. They have a terrific track record. And by the way, talking about local and that, this company here, they're from the area. In fact, the woman's mother that made the pitch to us there, she lives in Rockford. And so when that woman comes to work here for us, she stays with her mother in Rockford. She was raised here as well, so she's very familiar with the local area. If you want to talk local, thank you.
Thank you very much. I would just note, and I'll ask Ann to correct me if I say anything that's out of line with our purchasing code, but my understanding of this process is it falls under professional services. So it is not as compared to like a construction bid where it's lowest responsible bid. There is within our code, and it's consistent with other public agencies, the ability on a professional service hire to look at things other than price, not to say that price doesn't matter and that it's not a factor. But just making sure that this conversation is in fact in line with with the board's ordinance related to purchasing, and it is. I know I'm missing the process here. A follow-up I have Mrs. Gorel, then Mrs. Crosby on a follow-up. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you. I too have always thought about doing local, but when you have $15,000 difference, I have to look at that to see what I'm getting for that service before I can actually say that it's worth $15,000. To pay $15,000 more just to have someone local do it, I want to know what I'm getting for that service. Thank you. I will be voting no against it.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Mrs. Crosby on a follow-up, then Mr. Tassoni.
No.
Mrs. Crosby.
Yeah, this is just a comment. I just Googled GovHR, and I can't find them anywhere on the internet. So I'm not sure who they are, but I'm much more comfortable with somebody I know than somebody I don't.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know that I have an opinion on who may be a better search firm, GovHR versus Workforce. If one wanted to look at the cost savings and just use that as your analogy to vote for one, I guess you could go that way. Myself, I just really don't get it why we don't have the ability to find a person on our own within the resources the county has, whether it be media, whether it be a word of mouth or contacts with our HR, with our current administration. I just don't understand why it hasn't already been done for the administration, the HR, and whatever departments are involved to go out and at least seek that person and at least post a job description and a pay and at least get the ball rolling on that, and why it took till now to even get to a search firm to look at it, and just, I don't get it.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Any other follow-ups by board members? I would just add, regardless on this vote, is that I think it's very important, whichever direction the board goes forward, that we're not adopting a particular contract for either one of these. If I heard Mr. Fiducia correct in his motion, there would be working to finalize a contract with either the amended one or the other, because I just want to make sure if that process occurs, that we include the administration, specifically Steve, and that it's not just a committee chair, no disrespect, and an attorney, that it's somebody from professional staff or out of the administration office. What I'm seeing with almost every process right now, or too many of them, is that somehow we've retained an administrator to help us the next 3 months. Let's include him in those discussions on contractual matters and that, alongside legal, alongside the appropriate board folks. Any other quick questions or comments? Mr. Gurl?
Thank you, Chairman. Just so that we don't forget that we also have a vacancy as our HR director, our CFO, and we desperately need a deputy administrator also in that office to help with the administrator, whether it's Mr. Chapman right now, but definitely in the future. Those are positions that we should have been talking about, like Mr. Tassoni said, months ago. So it's frustrating that it's taken, I'm not sure how many months since Ms. Pascal has left, but here we are now, many months later, and we're still trying to decide who's going to go out and find the best person possible. So I really wish that we could have addressed this sooner and seen those other positions also onto a search. So thank you.
Thank you. So, oh, yes, Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairman. Just quickly, as I sit here looking at this price difference that we're talking about, I would like to know if it's possible to negotiate with Workplace in comparison to the other agency. So I'm just wondering if that's another avenue we can close that gap some, if they're the ones selected.
Since it's not resolved, then basically you're suggesting that if that goes in that direction, that that be a hot topic of discussion and a strong request from you that that be looked at very closely to close the gap. Okay, thank you. Anything you want to add, Mr. Fiducia?
No.
So the motion in, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Schultz.
I think Mr. Hoffman has a great idea, but I want to make sure that I understand with my vote if I'm voting for a very specific contract with a dollar amount associated with it, or if I'm just voting that we go with Workplace.
The motion by Mr. Boomer is to go with Workplace. There is not a direct contract tied to that, was my understanding. What I specifically heard in the motion was that there would be discussions after the adoption, the direction set by the board to finalize the contract. Is that correct, Mr. Fiducia?
I believe it is. Like everything else, I guess we could always change our mind if they don't work with us. But right now, as I said, it's a resolution authorizing the chairman to execute an agreement, and they're going to conduct a search, and it's going to be subject to review with the state's attorney's office.
Then Mr. Boomer, separate, after you read that in and we seconded it, Mr. Boomer made a motion, and that was seconded, to change the recommendation from HR Gov or Gov HR to Workplace. That was seconded. That is before the board. To Mr. Schultz's question, there is no specific contract we're adopting if, after the fact, there's going to be discussions to get approval from anybody, whether that includes the state's attorney or not. We're either adopting a contract or we're not. Am I saying that correct, Steve?
Yes, we do not at this time have a contract. All I received from the two individual firms was the fee estimate that they gave me. So the contract would have to be negotiated and then executed by yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Boomer, you had your hand up and you made the motion, so I defer to you. I'm going to go back to Mr. Webster a second time. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you. Going along with what Steve said, what both Steves here said, when he brought it up about the contract, and then you brought it up about the proposal, the price. Now, when they shot, both these companies gave you that proposal price, was that somewhat a firm proposal, or was that a negotiable proposal, or what was that?
Steve.
They did not indicate. I assume anything's negotiable, so.
Okay, thank you.
So the negotiation would be finalized after the direction is set by the board as to which firm. I think we're clear on that. Is there any confusion or disagreement? Mr. Fiducia, as committee chair, we're 100% clear. We're not adopting a contract. The board would be giving direction, a yes vote to Mr. Boomer's adoption, or his amendment would be to go with Workplace and to commence finalizing an agreement. That's what I believe we're all agreeing to at this time, and there's no confusion on that matter. Follow up, Mr. Tassoni, then Mr. Boomer. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just some food for thought, whoever, regardless of who the successful candidate is for this search. I would just hope that it's in the contract language that there's some consideration to these fees in relationship to if we actually get a person seated in that position? Are we obligated to this $34,000 and we never get a candidate that's hired? Or is that upon completion and successful applicant being hired?
So, fair questions, if anybody would like to take them. Can I just add this one part is, are we anticipating a finalized contract once worked on by Steve, once worked on and looked at from a legal standpoint from the state's attorney, obviously to involve you as the committee chair, to come back to this board to approve the actual agreement or not? Because I don't want an unhappy board where you said go with workplace or go with GovHR, and then there's people after the fact deciding the terms, and then you say, well, I would have this, or I just, my point is you're either giving a green light for them to finalize and go, or you're saying, go with the firm, finalize the contract, bring it back. And those are two different actions. And there's been a lot of questions about who's in charge and who makes final calls. And I want clarity on the board on this item. Do we have clarity on out of Mr. Fiducia, Steve, on what you guys want out of this? We can do it either way. Steve?
Well, my preference would be to have the board approve a firm and then let us negotiate the agreement and go forward.
Okay.
Rely upon us.
That is what you're recommending, and that's what we understand it to be at this time, unless changed by the board now. Okay. Again, I'm just making sure we don't have back-end issues, because I can understand how you could maybe infer that a couple ways. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So will the contract include the search criteria that what we're looking for in the candidate, or are we going to have the opportunity to define the parameters of the job? Will this board have that opportunity to do that?
Of course. I mean, you're the ones that the individual's going to work for, so.
Right. Is that built into the contract?
That would be built into the contract, yes.
So then it sounds to me like the contract has to, at least we have to see it before we execute it. If that's going to be, you know, or somehow we have to define what we want in the candidate. And we don't have that in front of us now.
No,
So
you don't.
It sounds to me like the contract has to come back here for that to happen.
So again, motion and second is to go with workplace, but there's obviously implications with a number of things. Steve suggested that the green light be given to finalize and move forward. Mr. Arenas raised the issue that there's issues maybe the board wants to have a final look at and either help shape and or final approve. But as it stands right at this moment, unless there's a separate change, is what's being asked and what was motioned in is to go with workplace. And if the board then would approve workplace in a separate item, that it's a green light to finalize a contract moving forward. The board may see it, but they wouldn't have a final bite at approving the actual agreement. That's how it stands right now. But the item Mr. Boomer's put before you is to go with workplace versus GovHR. That is what you'd be voting on. If you vote yes, we're going with workplace. If you vote no, we're staying with the motion, which is GovHR. And then we could sort out that separate issue. Mr. Boomer on a follow-up.
Call the question.
So the motion is to call the question, which would end debate, and it would end debate on the motion by Mr. Boomer to go with workplace. Do I have a second on calling the question? I see several hands up. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Hoffman. With that, all those in favor of calling the question and ending debate signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes. We've called the question. So I will, with that, a yes vote goes with workplace, amends the motion to go with workplace, and then in a separate action, we will approve the motion to go with workplace. Right now, we're amending the initial motion. It's not to pass, it's just to amend to change HR Gov out and put workplace in. So again, a yes vote changes who, and then in a separate action, we will officially approve going forward with whichever group you want to go with. A yes vote, again, amends. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schultz?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott? Was he yes? Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich? Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? Was he yes? Thank you. Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby? Mr. Fellers?
Yes?
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorl? Mr. Hoffman? Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors? Mrs. Red? Mr. Salgado? Unanimous? Yes.
Mr. Webster motion to me.
I'm sorry, I got one here with the no vote on the amendment.
Mr. Cassidy, no vote for Mr. Webster. So the motion, or the amendment, the motion to amend to go with workplace has passed. And now before the board is the motion to approve workplace as the search firm for the county administrator, which at this moment, unless changed by the board, would give the authority to somebody other than the board to finalize this contract and go forward. We're not disagreeing with that at all, correct? Yes, Mr. Schultz.
Yeah, just for the record, I'm requesting that the interim county administrator make best efforts to communicate to Workplace our concerns relative to the price difference and see if it is at all possible for them to reduce their fee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schultz. That's noted that the fee, specifically the fee and other items, are being asked to be addressed by Steve with Workplace, working alongside the state's attorney and I'm sure the Personnel Policy Committee. Yes, Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would echo Mr. Schultz's concern and also urge the board to do the same. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. To Mr. Arena's question, though, is the profile, that's addressed along the process that Workplace, I see Michael King from Workplace is here, and he's shaking his head yes, that I think Mr. Arena raised an interesting thing, is the profile, what you want, what others want in a county administrator, that's addressed in their process once they're engaged and they're working. That's correct, Michael? Okay, thank you. So that may address the concerns you had, Mr. Arena? Mr. Arena.
That will be, this board, all these members of this board will have the opportunity to weigh in on that, correct?
My understanding is everyone on the board is engaged in the search, creating the profile and the process of the search.
Right, at least if they choose to, they can.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Yes, Mrs. Gurl.
I'm sorry, but I still have a problem with this. I want to see both contracts side by side to see what the difference is. We can argue about one contract without even knowing what the other contract is, and I think this is where we've missed the boat. We should have had both of those contracts on the table at the same time. So that's why we're wasting time, because we don't do it right the first time around. I'd like to see this laid over. I want to see both contracts on the table so I know what I'm actually voting for and what I'm voting against. Thank you.
Is that a motion, Mrs. Gurl?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So Mrs. Gurl has made a motion to lay this over or send it back to committee?
Send it back to committee so we can take a
Okay.
look at both sides of the contract.
So the motion by Mrs. Gurl is to send back to the Personnel Policy Committee the amended resolution that would engage Workplace. May I have a second? Mr. Webster is a second to Mrs. Gurl's motion. So we have a motion, a second to send this back to committee. This item to send back to committee is now before the board for discussion or questions or comments. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This board fairly regularly instructs the administration to execute an agreement with someone that we think should do the work. It is not our job to get into the final contractual details and comparing one versus the other. That's how things never get done. And I trust Mr. Chapman and I trust the rest of our administration. When we give them direction, they will negotiate a great contract and we will go find a great next county administrator. So let's just get this done.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Any other questions? I'll go back to Mr. Webster a second time. Mr. Webster has the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Angie, and I think it is only fair for us to look at both contracts or both offers, what have you, I think it only made sense. We probably should have done that before we got this far. So we had proposals from both companies. They sat before us, and both of them told us what they could do, what they had to offer. But that was as far as that got. We didn't ever get a chance to get into the weeds about the cost with both of them, or see something in writing from both of them about the cost. We did talk about the cost from them, but we didn't see anything in writing. There was never specified. And true enough, we have a very brilliant administrator, and I'm sure he will look at all of this in the end run there. But oftentimes when we make purchases or buy things, we're looking at things ahead of us there in the balance. Certainly even with Public Works. They come before us there, we got the bids from 4 or 5 companies on buying a piece of equipment. Sometimes it is not the lowest bid. Sometimes it's the best bid. And in this case, I think that pertains as well. So that's why I will back what Angie had to say about sending it back to the committee until we get that much information. We could have a committee meeting next week and get that before us at our very next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. And if this is sent back to committee, I don't know if it will be or not. The only thing I would just say is what is signaled is a change in process, because at this point, there has not been a call for proposals widely, like in a true RFP or RFQ process, where people could, and there's not 2 fully negotiated contracts before the board for consideration. What there was, and please, Mr. Arena, you had a subcommittee that I think had a lot of discussion. Mr. Fiducia, in fairness, you had discussion too. You did entertain 2 different firms to come and present to a group of you all in a public meeting and perhaps in some follow-up conversations. So that was the process as I understand it. You're talking about really at this point a separate process from what I've seen to this point. If I'm wrong, I just want clarity on the floor so nobody's upset on the backside. Mr. Webster, am I saying that? Am I understanding the intent here?
I'm really not talking about a separate process. I'm talking about a complete process. So we did not have the complete process. That's what I'm saying to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster, for clarifying. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. When we talked to the 2, we never asked to see in writing what they would propose. It was just talking. We don't really do anything here that if it's only one company, it's one company. But if we're always asking, and did you go out for bids on this? Did you we have no comparison here. We have apples and oranges, and do they compare? No. We need something that we can match one with the other. That's what I'm saying. With $15,000 difference, I want to know what I'm getting for that $15,000. And I want to see it in writing before I decide which firm we would actually go with, and then hire a firm and then do a contract. I want to know prior to I hire that firm what my contract is going to consist of for $15,000 difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Mrs. Crosby on a follow-up.
Just 2 things. Both Mr. Webster and Ms. Gorel serve on this committee, so I don't know why this discussion didn't happen then, because that would make sense instead of on the board floor. And secondly, I would like to call the question.
We have a motion by Mrs. Crosby to call the question, and the question we're calling is whether or not to send it back to committee or not, so then we would just vote on that. Do I have a second to the motion to call the question? Mr. Boomer, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Hoffman on the second. So the motion seconds to call the question. If you vote yes, we will end discussion. If you vote no, we will continue the discussion about whether or not to send it back to committee. I hope that's very clear to everybody. A yes vote ends discussion. All those in favor of calling the question, ending discussion, signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? We've called the question, and the question we've called that now we're going to take a vote on is whether or not to send it back to the Personnel and Policy Committee. Just so we're clear on what this vote is. A yes sends it back to Mr. Fiducia's committee. A no vote keeps it right here for action this evening. With that, I'm going to ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote sends it to committee because that's the motion. A no vote keeps it here. Clerk, come out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tassoni?
No.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
No.
Mr. Arena?
No.
Mr. Billich?
No.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Butita?
No.
Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
Nope.
Mr. Fiducia?
No.
Mr. Girl?
No.
Mrs. Gora?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
No.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Neighbors? Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado? Mr. Schultz? 3 to 17, Mr. Chairman. Motion fails.
Okay, so motion fails, so the amended motion by Mr. Boomer to go with workplace is before the board for action. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I attended the presentation from both GovHR and Workplace at the Personnel and Policy Committee. And after hearing them both, I think they're both capable firms. What I felt that we're getting for that $15,000 difference was when Workplace was presenting, there was a lot of discussion in the committee about why would a very qualified candidate come to Winnebago County? And I felt, just based on Workplace's stature in the community, the work they've done before, how invested they are in the community, that they would do a better job of answering that question, of selling to a candidate, why should we come here? And I think that getting a high-quality candidate is worth that extra $15,000, and that's why I'm supporting them. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to echo kind of along with what Mr. Arena said there and with what you and Mr. Chapman said, we have an opportunity, obviously, to at least give this a try and see what the contract is going to look like. If there is anything that needs to be negotiated, I believe the administration is more than capable of doing that with Workplace, especially a local company. I believe that they would have more of a reason to negotiate with us and try to make sure that everyone's happy and we get what we actually need for this community. So, I mean, with that, I mean, I've been in business in our community for a long time and in a lot of different fields. One of my primary fields being construction, union construction worker, actually, as a matter of fact. And we've had a lot of work that we've done in this area, and we've done a lot of repair work by other companies that were undercutting our bids at the time. And we continue to do those repair works. So there's a popular saying within the music scene, actually, that rings true to me. The amount of money you spend is the amount of music you get. So for me, I do agree that we do need to make sure that it's competitive. We got to get the best pricing that we possibly can. We're all doing our jobs to make sure that we save as much money as we can, but at the same time, I believe utilizing a local company that can actually, that has been such a big part of the community and has community members in it, I believe they can sell this to the best of their capabilities to somebody that's coming to our area, if it is from out of town. And if it's from somebody that's in town, I do believe that they can sell it to where they're going to want to stay here too.
Thank you, Mr. Billick. Any other discussion by board members? Again, the motion is to go with Workplace. Oh, yes, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you. I just want to bring up that I've been on this board for about 12 years, and most of those 12 I was on it was under the very watchful eye of Mr. Chapman, and I'm very confident that Mr. Chapman is going to do what's best for this county, and he graciously came back to work for us, and I think he really loves this county, and I have 100% confidence in what he's going to do.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. Any other discussion on Mr. Boomer's amended motion to go with Workplace? Seeing none, I will ask the clerk to call the roll, please. A yes vote goes with Workplace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Webster.
Mr. Webster.
I'm sorry, I'm just asking yay or yes or no?
Yes, because this is a a vote to get an administrator. We need an administrator, I realize that. And even though that's not my choice, that is the one that I will vote yes for.
Thank you, Mr. Webster.
That was a yes?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby?
Yes.
Mr. Fellers?
Yep.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Girl?
Yes, but can I explain a few things?
Moving on.
Mrs. Gorel? Mr. Hoffman? Mr. Kelly? Mr. McDonald? Mr. Neighbors? Mrs. Red? Mr. Salgado? Mr. Schultz? Mr. Tassoni? It's a unanimous decision, Mr. Chairman.
After all that. Lord have mercy. I'm going to turn things back over to Mr. Fiducia after testing our parliamentary skills.
Thanks a lot.
Wow.
We'll be
Mr.
bringing in some information, reference an HR director very shortly to you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes my report.
Thank you. Mr. Schultz, drive safe. Zoning Committee, Mr. Webster.
We have nothing, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Economic Development Committee, Mr. Billick.
We have no report.
Thank you as well. Unfinished business. I just want to officially ask the Finance Committee to take up those two items. If we need to retweak the name of those two IT items that connected to public safety because it more reflects the actual reality, that's great. That was a suggestion of a board member, but I would ask the Finance Committee and any other committees that are tagged in to take that item up in the next cycle officially. Mr. Girl, under unfinished business.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to echo your thoughts and what you just said. I think it's imperative for this board to take that back up and find an alternative funding source, whether it's host fees or some other budget line item that we can take from. But I would urge us to bring that back forward and at least give us the opportunity to vote on that again. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Girl. Any other unfinished business? Any other new business before we get to a reading in of an appointment? Seeing none, under new business, North Park Water Department, the appointment recommendation is Kelly Freeman for term beginning January 2020 through April 2021. There is an annual stipend of $1,200, and that is read in for first reading. With that, any other discussion? We do have a closed session request related to opioid litigation, and I'll read that in a second. Bear with us. We'll be in and out in 5 minutes. If you give us 5 minutes of closed session, I think it's a worthwhile update. There's been plenty of movement. With that, I would entertain a motion to go to closed session, and it's related to the appoint. Oh, I apologize. Yeah, Miss. Yeah, did you have another new business item? No. Yes, we've read that in. There was, go ahead. Yes, we can. That would be, I need a motion then. Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. Maybe I misunderstood. A motion by Mr. Webster and a second by Mrs. Gorel on the appointment of Kelly Freeman. Item is now before the board for action. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Webster. All those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We've suspended the rules. I'd entertain a motion to approve Kelly Freeman, or Friedland to the North Park Water District. Mr. Webster, second Mr. Girl. Item is now before the board. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We've unanimously appointed Kelly to the North Park Water District. So thank you very much. With that, I'd entertain a motion to go to closed session related to litigation when an action affecting or on behalf of the public body has been filed and is pending before a court or administrative tribunal, or when a public body finds that an action is probable or imminent in which case, for the findings shall be recorded and entered into the minutes of the closed session. Can I have a second, please, or a motion by Mr. Hoffman, a second by Mr. Fellers? All those in favor of going to closed session signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We'll go to closed. We'll start in 2 minutes. Opposed? Have a good evening. Thank you very much.